Today on Business Focus, we are talking about succession planning or key people risk. Essentially, every business has someone that there isn't shadow resource for, someone that if they leave, there's potentially going to be a giant gap after they go. So it could be the person who runs the business, it could be a key leader. And to talk about that today, to understand what you can do to mitigate that risk and to build capacity in key roles, I am joined by Gavin Houchell, Director of the Acquire Group. Hello,
Thank you,
Gavin.
Brendan. Thank you for joining me.
Joining you. Oh. You're welcome. Thanks. All right, so let's sort of detail the problem, I guess. When you're talking to businesses, whether it's with your search and recruitment or your leadership development focus, what are you seeing as the biggest risk businesses face? And maybe we start with as an owner operator or a CEO GM type thing.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first thing to so thanks for inviting me in today. I think the first thing to always be conscious of is when how do leaders make the decision they're perhaps moving on? I think that's probably important to unpack and perhaps think about the dimensions at play, Brendan. So I always think through, well, what is driving the leader to perhaps make a change? Mm-hmm. And that might, in their own mind, might be to do with a stage in life, their age, their health perhaps, their financial goals, or perhaps they've just got a new passion project and they might run the business for 10, 15, 20 years and they've just had this sort of a semi-epiphany of it's time to perhaps pass the baton.
So step one is actually understand what you want to achieve in terms of your own exit if you are the boss, and from there that at least gives you an awareness of the roadmap or the runway you've got to then build someone up or build multiple people up potentially.
Absolutely, I'd say always not picking up on your key man risk. You want to have de-risk it in some ways, but I think equally it's important for the current leader and potential future leaders to understand what some of the objectives are for the business and where they've got to and perhaps where they're headed. And then equally, has that current leader and owner got clarity and comfort about letting go?
Okay, so when you've seen it done well, when you've seen someone go, right, I decided that within, 5 years, I need to be out of this business and I want to go live in the Bahamas or whatever. What's I guess, let's go through the steps. What's step one in terms of, I guess, identifying who in the business is potentially capable of stepping up and then enabling them to do that?
Good question. So I think, again, understanding where the business is today, but most importantly, where do you feel and where is the business headed in 3 years' time? Because clearly the journey and roadmap of that business will probably determine the quest of, well, what type of leader is required.
Right, so potentially people at the time you make a decision to back out won't be a good fit for where you want the business to be or what you're building towards.
Possibly. So back to that comment of, is it to maintain the business trajectory? Is it to build the business? Is it to build to sell?
Yeah.
So I think understanding those drivers, and equally it's sometimes important for the current leader and owner to perhaps have some independent advice. It might be they have an executive coach to think through, are they ready? What's the plan? And equally, how do we then think about those capabilities that are going to take it from position 1 to position 2? And that could be over a year, that could be, as you said, 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Okay. So I guess talk to me about, once you've established those capabilities based on where you want the business to be, people have got jobs, they're already working. Presumably your leadership team is busy doing what they're doing. How do you find time? How do you structure their weeks, their months, their quarters, whatever, to start filling in the gaps around those capabilities? Or is it often, do you see that people go outside the business at that point? Great
question. I think I always encourage a leader to look with the strengths and known weaknesses that they have in front of them today. So that's looking at the current team. Now, equally, if you put some context around this, really a CEO job, the drivers are looking after your people, that look after your customers, run an efficient business, and you make money. So in a simplistic form, I know that's rather simple. We'd all get up and be finished by Wednesday afternoon. But in that context, it's looking at the current capabilities and understanding where those strengths lie. That might be in financial, operational, commercial, strategic thinking. But it might also be equal for a sensible idea for the current owner and CEO to work, perhaps if they've got an executive coach, of thinking about, well, what are the things that if, for example, you're on a 2-year wind out of the business, what are your core capabilities and what are your potential successes internally? And how do you then adjust your job, your own job description, over that 6, 9, 12, 18-month journey, because effectively you do have to change your role and responsibility to get others ready.
So you're talking there about like progressively relinquishing parts of your role as the CEO or the owner operator, whatever, to sort of progressively enable others to empower them to do portions of your job over time.
Absolutely, okay. Absolutely. And I think it's important to state for people that not everyone wants to lead the business as well. So it's determining those factors of, again, back to that key risk. How do you assess that capability?
Yep.
How do you understand what capability, firstly, what you're actually after in terms of competencies, and then obviously bridging that gap along the way. And that may come in from the current CEO or owner playing a more active role around coaching. It could actually be introducing mentors and external coaches for 1 or 2 or 3 internal people as well that build that capability and help them go on that journey.
Okay, so just kind of taking a step back just to kind of prior to these. So what we're really talking about is, as the person who's looking to eventually leave the business, you're going to need to understand what you're directly contributing, break down your own skills so that you understand what you'd be looking for holistically if you were to replace yourself.
Yep.
And then from there, you're probably going to need to go through the exact same process with your senior leadership team to understand where the gaps are, who's got the strengths that could fill that, and then start incrementally allocating those parts of your role to one or more of those people to see how that plays out. Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. All right. That sounds very tangible and usable. So, okay, we've talked a bit there about the owner looking to leave, but let's talk about key people who leave potentially unexpectedly. A lot of senior leaders have a 3-month, exit period, but even that isn't particularly long. It'll go quickly. So, what do you recommend businesses do to make sure that they've got that shadow resource and that they get rid of that key person risk in their exec team? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a real challenge, and it becomes more evident the smaller the organisation is by virtue of spans and layers and resource available. So I think I don't have the silver bullet for a 20, 30 person business, but as you mature and you're 100, 150, 200 person business, then absolutely risk mitigation at both the ELT level and the senior management level needs to come into play. So I think that's, but I think the other way of flipping it, Brendan, is the primary responsibility of any leader, and that might be the big boss or somebody that's running a small department, is to invest in their people. Your primary role is to make your team better than when they started, and the benefit of that clearly is capabilities grow. Confidence grows. People, as they say, people leave leaders, they don't leave businesses. So if you're investing in people, generally in this middle territory, you've probably got a 3-year capacity in the job. Now, not everyone. You have some what you call keepers that are solid rocks that might stay in their job, happy and content for 7, 8, 9 years.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Carl and Phil here in our team, like 10, 12 years and 18 years, I think, in our exec team.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Every business needs a blend of individuals. Clearly, you don't want an executive that comes in on a Monday and leaves on a Friday. That's not a good sign, clearly. But I think it's investing in those individuals and building that capability. But then it's also thinking about, what are the aspects? What would make somebody leave? Is it the fact that they're moving location and you can't support that? Or is it the fact that they have a thirst to learn something new? So it's then sort of spending the time. So this is back to the role of the primary leader is getting the best out of their individuals.
So how do you make sure that development's great and agree, but when you're looking at de-risking your business, how do you make sure that professional development piece is really targeted on what the business needs that person to improve on to essentially, have a wider range of skills? So let's take an example. For example, like let's say, a CTO exits the business, you get 200 seats. What should you have been doing 6 months, 12 months before that to make sure that when that happens, you're well set to replace that person without too much, productivity loss in that period?
Yeah, I think you have to be honest and authentic with your own expectations as the leader, i.e. if there is, back to that statement of if you've got 4 direct reports and no team beneath that, is there ability to have sort of a subset leader or a shadow leader in the respect, or is it a case of where there's a chasm between the C-suite and the pillar leadership, and the reality is you just do have to go external for that talent. Right. But you don't want to derail individuals, because I always say, I remember sitting down with a chief human resources officer in an Asia Pac focus role many years ago, and their statement to me still rings true now, a decade on. to a point externally, they've got to be at least 30% better than somebody internally, because the known knowns are here in an internal perspective. You understand their strengths, you understand their weaknesses. I always say everyone's got some skeletons in the closet. It's just understanding what those are and what impact those are. Because if you think about those capabilities that you touched on before, capabilities are driven by the skills that people have, the knowledge that they acquire and accumulate in the tenure of their job, but also their behaviours. So how many times have we seen as leaders where they have the capability, but the behaviours are not right, or something's derailed those behaviours? So I think it's just working through those. But in answer to your question of that silver bullet, it is a challenge for many smaller organisations.
So the flatter the structure, the bigger the risk, essentially, because you're less likely to have that sort of next level of management kind of ready to step up. That 30% gap you mentioned, it's much more likely that the gap between that exec who leaves and the next person in a flatter structure is going to be more than 30. So you've really got to go external.
True, but equally the way to switch that round as well is to think about, well, what are your expectations of that new CTO or the new CFO or the new HR director? You need to be cognizant that back to that statement of perhaps a 3-year life journey. You're learning in your first year. You're then putting into practice what you've learned. You're then extending, and then you should be passing the baton. Now, as I said, not everyone will last 3 years, and some people will want to last longer, and some actually sadly move, within 18 months, 2 years. I mean, we won't get into the Gen Y discussion of staff moving around, but surely it's again the leader being clear on what are their expectations when someone perhaps does step up. There is going to be a chasm. So how do you then build that in that first 6, 9, 12 months for your own expectations, but also setting somebody up for success, because they're not going to compete with somebody that was a subject matter expert and been in the saddle for 4, 5, 6 years previously. They were accomplished. Yeah. We're not appointing an accomplished CTO in that scenario.
Yeah, okay. So where have you seen, a virtual bench done well? So should a CEO be working with, potentially someone like yourself to ensure that there's, that they have access to good candidates and they're having conversations with people, just casual conversations, keeping in touch with a certain type of or quality of executive out there? Like I've often heard virtual bench used as a term, but I'm just keen to sort of dig into how does that work in practice? How's it done well?
I think it's very difficult for SME businesses to have the capacity or the resource and financial backing to create what you call talent maps. Now, clearly, each business has its own nuances, and if you take recruiting a managing director in the leadership team for a cybersecurity team as opposed to recruiting a managing director for a fast mover consumer goods that perhaps produces perishable goods and sells to Coles and Woolies. So one might be sales and technical led, one might be more supply chain and safety related and so forth. So even though effectively that managing director role competencies are transferable from company A to company B, the experiences and the depth of capabilities will vary accordingly. So businesses that are considering around how do you manage that, there will be facets of their business where absolutely active pipeline management is really critical. So your business, your customers come first, so you need to be conscious of that, and obviously the technical skills, but also the way that your organisation conveys and works with customers. Doesn't mean it's the same in every MSP. Other positions that might be in the organisation could come from a whole variety of sectors. So I think it's just being mindful of one size doesn't fit all in one organisation, but clearly a CEO that is conscious of, well, what's the industry doing? What are the external factors? How what's the typical attrition for a certain skill set in one's industry? How networked are they? So how much are they doing PR to win customers versus how much are they messaging to say, we're a great place to work and this is why we're a great place to work. So you can bring in a community that understands your world, but there's a balance of how much time and energy you put into what we'd call pipeline management.
You said talent plan there, talent planning. Can you dive into that? Like it's a nice catchy little term. What does it look like in practice?
So some of my customers, we actively work on certain skill sets at certain levels where we will have an open mandate to, we'll be retained to spot certain types of rare skill sets. Okay. We will interview, we may not have an actually active assignment, so it's a very reverse way of recruiting in some respects.
Find the people and then create a role for them, kind of thing.
Sort of, or at least engage. So, for example, if a certain skill set is typically hired every 9, 12 months, but it could take 6, 8 months to find, we're getting ahead of the curve, and the organisation will invest in that. And they will actively retain us to do the first phase. They will then engage with that and do what you'd call a talent interview. And then the magic of it is then obviously then managing expectations, because if everyone falls in love, but we don't have an opportunity, how do you bridge that gap of could the opportunity be in 4 months, 8 months, 12 months? And again, there's the art and science of being visible and connected, but also not taking people down the garden path and not being able to deliver.
Yeah, well, that's the hard part, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
hey, I want to talk to you about a role, and they get excited. It's like, well, there actually isn't a role, but there potentially could be in the future. So it seems to me that in that scenario, the key factors or key elements to be aware of as a business leader would be, what's your attrition rate, basically? Like, what's your employee churn? How long have you historically been able to keep people in that role? And then surely tracking employee sentiment would be really important, right? Because you would understand the flight risk based on basically EMPS. Yeah. So particularly good ways to do that, or to understand those metrics that you've seen. What's your preference?
Yeah, we have to obviously from an external perspective let an organisation lead its data-led decision making around talent. Right. So different people use different products. Some are just, hey, we have a problem here. We don't know the underlying driver. Can you find out a little bit about it?
Yeah.
So we'll be served as a service provider based on what our clients' requests are, more so than us providing the framework or tool or data analytics to come up with that answer.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, a CEO or department leader or pretty much any leader, as part of their weeklies and monthlies, should be asking the key people in their departments or that feed into them is how are people, like what's the happiness score, what issues are we hearing, what roles do we potentially need to be backfilling now, like what do we need to get ahead of, or ideally how do we keep our people, if we've got a problem, how do we address that so we don't have to do anything about it? I think again it's all got to be somewhat structured, somewhat data led, because these costs, right, are pretty huge. This is a massive overhead for the business if not done effectively.
Absolutely. And the transitional costs, the onboarding costs, the coming up the yield curve. So absolutely, if you're a leader and you've got a team of 20, 30 in your span of control, if your weekly stand-ups or if your monthly reviews are not got a heavy people focus, you're going to come unstuck.
Probably the one thing I probably want to finish on in terms of succession planning and key people risk is just key people are obviously sort of by definition rarer. Therefore, with a lower turnover, there's, I assume, a less structured onboarding process for those roles, because it just doesn't happen as often, right? And there isn't typically sort of an HR person sitting above them doing that. They might do the HR policies and workplace health and safety and stuff. But what do you see as an issue, generally speaking, when it comes to executive onboarding? Like how is it done well in your experience? Is it what should people be looking to make sure they do in those first 3 months to ensure a rapid onboarding and productivity increase?
Yeah, the first, picking up your point of is it done well, I would love to give you a raft of wonderful examples of onboarding that I've probably got more of the other end of the spectrum.
Which is my assumption, right?
Yeah,
It is hard.
It is, and there's also assumptions made. You're the expert in X, so
over you go.
Look, so to me, there's a dual track strategy in this area. One is everyone should have the same experience of being onboarded from front of house to the CEO, because that's then begets the DNA of the organisation, and equally the new chief sales officer gets to see what the operations director saw 6, 12, 18 months ago, and obviously that should be it's not a set it and then not look at it for 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
But equally, depending on, again, the mandate of the role and where that fits in terms of some might be a subject matter expert that's to the far left of the organisation versus an integral cog of the organisation. Relationships are really key in that first 90 days. There's a lot of really topical books and value about that onboarding. So we talk a lot about getting executives ready to perhaps take on the boss job. Equally, how do you, when you find them and you've hired them, that first 90 days is absolutely critical for their success. It's scary how so much effort goes into the front end, and it's a bit like organizations. We've won a customer, right? What's the next one? You do need to be very, very conscious. And equally, the stakeholders that are either buddy systems or the CEO they're reporting to or the board need to also understand that their role is going to be over-indexed on ensuring, not checking on them every 30 seconds, but there is a structured program of how do we make sure, are we on track? Do we need to do more? Do we actually need to do less?
Yeah, and so buddy system you touched on there is I think a key one, right? But yeah, and it's probably going back to what we talked about before as well, with whatever system you're using, those weekly one-on-ones, particularly on the onboarding. It's not even probably weekly; it's daily, right? Let's talk about what the plan is for today, or we've already got the plan. Let's make sure that you're on track and you're happy and blah blah. But and exactly the same with the new client. You know, you don't just go, "Hey, welcome on board. See you in a month." It's you know, day 1, day 3, whatever. So okay, that's probably a good place to finish it, I think. And look, if you've got any questions around or want to know more about how to effectively plan for your own exit, if you're a business leader or owner or key people within your business, Gavin will be happy to have a chat. He's on LinkedIn. The Acquire Group, obviously, is the entity that he is the director for. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.